Remember last time we were talking about Hebrews chapter 11 and the heroes and heroines of faith. And before we end that discussion, we really need to pause and consider Sarah, who is the first named female of faith. A controversy has evolved around the placing of Sarah in that roll call, and certain issues need to be resolved. The verse in question is Hebrews 11:11, chapter 11, verse 11. It reads, "By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised." This verse follows three sentences in which Abraham's faith is described like this. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise as in a foreign land, for he looked forward to a city with the foundations whose architect and builder is God. Immediately following is the verse, by faith, Sarah, as it begins. By faith, Sarah herself. That feminine pronoun herself is really kind of intensive in Greek. What I mean is that the pronoun is unnecessary and is used for emphasis, singling out Sarah. By faith, Sarah herself, goes on to say. In the most straightforward view of the sentence, Sarah is in the nominative case, that is, she's the subject, but some commentators claim that Abraham is the subject and not Sarah. They make Abraham alone the exemplar of faith in this series of sentences. In fact, in some translations, Abraham has supplanted Sarah as a model of faith in the text. And Sarah, a model of faith, has been demoted to simply a footnote. Some have objections to Sarah being included as a model of faith, a hero of faith, thinking she is not worthy or even not a logical example. Remember, we're looking at kind of a psychological construct of Priscilla as the author of Hebrews. So if in fact Sarah is a dubious example, then we have to say that Priscilla, the author, is willing to overlook some of Sarah's failures and to see her in a more favorable light. I think a woman, more likely than a man, would in fact be willing to overlook Sarah's initial skepticism. In fact, a woman would go, yeah, right. If I was 90 years old, I would be feeling the same way. Maybe Priscilla takes a second look at Sarah's skepticism and looks at it from a different perspective. The time has come for us to do the same. The incident we're talking about is found in the 18th chapter of Genesis. Three supernatural messengers tell Abraham that Sarah will conceive and bear a son. Sarah, in another room, overhears the conversation, and since she is far past the age for childbearing, it says she laughed to herself. But consider this, no one has yet spoken directly to Sarah. Not these three angelic messengers. Nobody's talked to Sarah. Unlike Abraham, she's had no opportunity to evaluate the authority or the supernatural charisma of these three messengers. In fact, Sarah is not even asked why she laughed, but the question was put to Abraham. Why did Sarah laugh? Apparently, Sarah is finally able to evaluate these messengers on her own, and she finds herself in awe of them. It was out of her fear that she denied having laughed. So then, are we to dismiss Sarah as just some sort of amused skeptic? No. But let's look at the 17th chapter of Genesis In verses 15 through 17, it says that God said to Abraham, and that's the beginning. God said to Abraham. This is now not the direct message from the trio of visitors, but a revelation from heaven. God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations. Kings of peoples shall come to her." So before we dismiss Sarah, who was twice blessed in that passage, look how Abraham responded to the promise from God. Genesis 17:17 tells us, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed." Okay, let's visualize this. When we read verse 17 that he bowed low, we usually have the impression that Abraham was bowing in submission, humbling himself, but that's not how it should be read. We can now see more clearly that what was happening, we can see from a better translation of the Hebrew, which reads, "Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself," on and on. Abraham was bent over double because he was convulsed with laughter. Even worse, some say that he was putting on a show by bowing before God, but laughing in his heart at the divine revelation. In either case, we should ask ourselves, why does the world remember Sarah's subdued laughter, of which she soon repented, fearful because she did in fact believe? And why do we hold her culpable for it, while at the same time we forget that Abraham fell on his face, overcome with what can only be described as derisive laughter? One commentator says, quote, "It is a generous interpretation of the text to assume Sarah acted by faith," unquote. But maybe this is exactly what we should add in our understanding of the author's depiction of Sarah. Priscilla has a generosity in evaluating the spiritual role of Sarah in her nation's history, seeing her intrinsic faithfulness instead of her momentary confusion and disbelief. In that case, the author of Hebrews is not only feminine, she can be called a feminist. Abraham is said to have looked forward to a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. In the next sentence, though, Sarah was enabled to found a posterity and fulfillment of God's promise. Apparently, Priscilla is intentionally comparing Abraham and Sarah. On the one hand, there was the city, which had the foundations, which was the capital of a nation. And on the other hand, there was Isaac, who was the foundation of the chosen people, the seed of Abraham, destined to be the heir of the land of promise and of the city which had those foundations. Once again, and sadly, there are those translators and commentators who want to make Abraham alone as the model of faith, who want to make Abraham the focus of the story, even going so far as to say that the promise for procreation was to Abraham and not to Sarah. Some want to say that Abraham was past childbearing years, but that's just bad grammar. And it shows a shocking ignorance of human biology and physiology. Some want to read that Abraham became the father of Isaac, even though Sarah was barren. Even though. All of this represents the basest form of prejudice and chauvinism. There are several linguistic and stylistic problems in trying to make Abraham the subject of those passages. While we know that the word order is flexible in Greek, there are certainly logical limits to it. Which sentence sounds smoother and more elegant as the writer is? Would it be, by faith, he received power, appropriation, even though he was past the right age and Sarah herself was barren? Or compared to, by faith, Sarah herself, though barren, was enabled to found a posterity. Which one is awkward and which one is a smoother writing? It's more elegant construct that is in conformity with the style of the letter to the Hebrews of Priscilla's complete writing. Evidence for this reference to childbearing past normal age and the stylistic considerations secure the place of Sarah as the subject of Hebrews 11:11, and she belongs in the role of a model of faith. She is one of the true heroes of faith. We need to envision how Priscilla thought about Sarah, and to go beyond the conventional view that Sarah fell from grace by laughing at the revelation of God. Priscilla knows, as all believers must know, that temporary doubt, fear, and denial can be transmuted into steadfast faith. If this weren't so, what hope would any of us have on our spiritual journey? We all start off with doubt and fear and denial even. Sarah is certainly a great example of that one who moved from doubt and denial to great faith. And by faith, she was enabled to found a nation. Now, there's another woman who is mentioned, though not by name, in Hebrews chapter 11. In verse 23, we read, by faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. That story is told originally in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. In Exodus, the mother acts alone in making the decision to hide Moses, preparing the papyrus basket, placing the basket on the riverbank, while the sister of the baby stood watch. In the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, which was the Bible of Priscilla, both parents are credited with hiding the baby for 3 months. Exodus 2 verse 3 says, when they could no longer hide him, his mother took for him an ark and smeared it with bitumen and cast the child into it and put it in the ooze by the river. Nice. It is this chapter that we find the sympathetic reference to, of all people, Pharaoh's daughter. While there are so many women in chapter 11, the heroes of faith chapter, it becomes clear, yeah, this is a woman who wrote this. But before leaving chapter 11, we also need to discern a reference to the ministry of those additional women in that chapter. Although the women themselves are not in the catalog of heroes, their contribution in religious history is included in the story. In verse 12, there are 3 pairs of names that have been inverted chronologically so that the more recent person is named first. For example, usually you would say, for example, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and me. In this instance, it's me, my father, my great-grandfather, so on and so on. And those, so that what we have is that the most recent person is named first, and the oldest person or the farthest back in history is named next. And we have those pairs of names like Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah, David and Samuel. Each of the lesser individuals, those named separate, was indebted to a woman for his place in the story. Hebrews chapter 11 is referencing back in Judges chapters 4 and 5, Barak, who actually owed his victory to Deborah, Jephthah, who owed his victory to his daughter's sacrifice in Judges 11, Samuel owed his ministry to the dedication of his mother Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And by resorting to this subtle linguistic device of name inversions, Priscilla, the author of Hebrews, is trying to convey this message that God used the discrete ministries of women, singularly chosen by God, to bring about the history, the world-changing deliverance that was given to us in the hand of Gideon and Samson and David. The references to the women in chapter 11 of Hebrew illustrates the casualties of sacred history. Sarah originated the people of God. Rahab facilitated the entry of the people into the promised land. Hannah, through Samuel, was the contributor to the rise of David. In addition to all of that, the very subtlety with which that theme is developed in the letter to the Hebrews shows us the restrained hand of a woman named Priscilla. So, looking back at it all, the presence of women here is so pervasive, so important throughout the whole 11th chapter of Hebrews. And their influences in all cases are noble. Their deeds are essential in God's providential activity, and their faith becomes a touchstone for all of us. Their faith is what points to the Savior. Their faith is what points to the power of God, and their submission and cooperation to God's plan. The heroes of faith is a much better story than what we've been told. But there's more of that to come. Have a good week.